So first, how many of you have been out to a natural gas pipeline, an old one, the old-fashioned kind? A few, okay. And how many of you have been out to a new type of pipeline? Just a few, okay. All right, so Karen and I are going to talk a little bit about pipelines today, massive gas pipelines that are going through the Delaware watershed, the types of wetlands and stream crossings that are happening with these pipelines, the cumulative and environmental impacts that are happening because of these pipelines. I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to close out a little bit with citizen action and the Delaware River Basin Commission. How many of you know about the Delaware River Basin Commission? Just to get a feel. Okay, all right, great. The Delaware River Basin Commission is what's standing between us and fracking right now. So that's the key thing to remember with the Delaware River Basin Commission. They're very powerful. And as citizens, we need to engage them and let them know that we are there and we are watching. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then Karen Feridun is going to talk about FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as the regulatory regime with pipelines, Eminent Domain, and the Constitution Pipeline. How many of you have heard of the Constitution? Oh, Commonwealth Pipeline. Commonwealth, how many people have heard of that? Okay, great. As you can see, I haven't worked on the Commonwealth Pipeline. So, first, just a little bit about natural gas pipeline delivery systems, right? This is not oil and this is not coal. Natural gas works a little bit like electricity does. So you can't really store it like you can coal and oil, and you have different types of mechanisms for getting the gas from the production well to the those of us in the homes that have natural gas. How many of you have natural gas in your homes? Okay, all right. So if you're thinking of it from a tree perspective, you've got the gathering lines or the roots of the tree, which are the frac pad sites. Again, how many of you know about fracking? Yay, 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 good, good, good. The transmission lines are those in-between lines that connect the pads to the distribution lines, and the distribution lines are those lines that are going to go into your home, okay? So to give you a flavor for that, here is a typical pad site. You can see the rig on the top, right here, right? And here you can see a gathering line. So the thing to remember is that every single pad site, every fracking pad site needs to have a gathering pipeline that goes to it. So you have a 5-acre pad site in general, and then you have a pipeline that must go to that pad site. In general, these are lines that have the raw gas, again, so there's no odorant in it. You know, in your house, if you have the gas on, you'll notice an odor. They do that for safety, so our brains don't shut down and we don't die because natural gas is not good for us. But again, these are the important gathering lines, and out in where they're drilling in the Susquehanna Basin in the southwest corner, there's a lot of these, and I'll show some slides a little bit later. Here you can see again, here's the pad site. You've got a lot of water and things. We're not talking about that today, but there you can see that pipeline going off to connect to a transmission line somewhere. In the Delaware watershed right now, we're dealing only with transmission lines. And as a biologist with Delaware Riverkeeper Network, I will tell you that that is enough. We have our hands full trying to keep up with the transmission lines that are coming through and that are proposed. Delaware Riverkeeper Network is very strongly opposed to any natural gas pipelines going through. We believe it's fueling the fracking craze. We believe that's an unsustainable fuel. So just telling you that right up front, that our view is that we should have no pipelines. We do, in some instances, work to look at other ways to put in pipelines more sustainable, but again, they're all tapping into a finite fossil fuel, and we do not support the extraction of that fossil fuel. So these transmission lines run, again, in between the pad sites and your home, right? And they run for many miles, and they are very, very high in PSI, 200 pounds to 1,500 pounds per square inch of pressure in these transmission lines. There have been failures and corrosion of these lines. Karen may talk a little bit about that. But the transmission line that I know that exploded maybe about 2 years ago was up in Milford in the area where they're doing a upgrade, is what they call it, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline. But they run for many, many miles. And they often run through a lot of forested areas. Sometimes they run along existing right-of-ways, sometimes not. But again, you kind of get a feel. Can people see the slides without the lights off? Okay. So the other thing then, besides those transmission lines, is every 50 or 60 miles you have to have a compressor station. These compressor stations compress the gas, keep it moving at a speed that's conducive to get it from point A to point B. Methane and other things emit from these compressor stations, and there's been a lot of work by Clean Air Council and others to look at methane emissions from these compressor stations. Once the transmission line takes the gas to your city gate station, at the city gate is where you're adding that additive that makes the gas smell, right? So that when it goes into your home, you can safely use the gas and hopefully know if there would be a problem. And then at the distribution lines, those little lines that go into your house, if you have the gas, much smaller, 2 inches to 24 inches. I failed to mention the transmission lines are usually about 28 to 30 inches. Sometimes they may go up to 40 inches in diameter. But back to the distribution, they're much smaller, right? I know there's tons. I live in a very old community. It's about 100 years old. I'm the first suburb out of Philadelphia, and we always have a lot of gas leaks because they have to go in and keep fixing the old infrastructure. And this is just something to think about when you're thinking about gas and the infrastructure it takes to move gas and the energy it takes to move gas, and then the lifetime of the pipelines themselves. It's a big investment in money that needs to be put in to actually extract this fossil fuel. So why do we care? These numbers are from 2011. They're going to be hard to see, but as I said, in the Delaware Basin, we thankfully have a moratorium on gas drilling. There has been no drilling because of citizen action and the Delaware River Basin Commission wanting to have regulations in place, special protection regulations to protect the water. We believe here at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network that there should be no gas drilling. It's not indicative of the special protection waters where they want to drill, so therefore we want to keep it out. But to give you a feel for, again, this infrastructure, January to December of 2011, there were over 5,700 drilling permits issued by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. That's about 23 drilling permits a day. Has anyone looked at a drilling permit? Okay, they're scant. I'll tell you that much. It's pretty amazing when you see what goes into actually a drilling permit. And of those 5,700 drilling permits in 2011, 2,900 wells roughly were drilled, right? So a lot of times the companies will get the permit, they'll hold on to the permit, but they may not drill, right? Drilling is very expensive. It takes a lot of energy to drill, so they don't, a lot of times they're just holding on to those permits. And we're really only at the tip of the iceberg for drilling in Pennsylvania. Has anyone been out to the drilling area, say Bradford, Susquehanna County? Okay. So when you see what's happening in those areas, think of it as really only the tip of the iceberg of what the corporations want to do in the way of drilling in our state and how our state will change if the estimates are what they say. 60,000 wells could be drilled in total, for example, in Pennsylvania. Again, we have a lot of stream miles. So these pipelines that are moving through have to cut through streams and they have to cut through wetlands. We have a lot of water in Pennsylvania. So there are 3 major interstate pipelines in the Delaware watershed. There's the Millennium Line, the Tennessee Line, and the Columbia Line. And there's already been additions to these lines on the Tennessee and the Columbia and the Millennium. And we've seen a lot of damage from it. And I'm going to show you some pictures of that because as a biologist, I spend a lot of time out in the field looking at the areas where the pipelines are going in and then looking at the damage that the pipelines create afterward if we're not successful at stopping them, which is always our goal. There are over 13 major pipelines proposed for the Delaware River Basin, and this is why Delaware Riverkeeper Network believes it's absolutely critical that the Delaware River Basin Commission get involved. And we have literature up here about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And you'll see different lines. Karen's going to talk a little bit about the Commonwealth right here. It's changed its route, but again, this is in the Schuylkill watershed, Schuylkill, Berks County, Chester County. So pipelines are coming to a town near you. I know I heard our attorney saying just the other day too, I believe there were 2 new pipelines proposed that are not on this map. We keep getting the map updated, but it gets expensive. So you know, there's more and more pipelines that are coming and affecting us all as fracking gets underway. So talking a little bit about the streams and the stream crossings and the kinds of stream crossings. Failed to mention some of these slides are Aaron Semplewitz's slides. He's an attorney with Delaware Riverkeeper Network. He's working really hard on this. So we got the dry ditch and the wet ditch, and what Aaron always likes to say is they're all bad ways, and they all have impacts. Some are less bad than others, right? But I want to show you just a few diagrams to give you a feel for the types of crossings. So a dry ditch crossing is when the pipeline company, the orange is the pipeline itself, right? The stream is running vertically. They lay the pipe, but they somehow either channel the stream through dams and through flumes to kind of keep the stream enclosed so that the water body itself is not being trenched or dug when they dig the pipeline, but it's actually, you know, kind of bypassing the pipeline trench. They dig a trench here to run the pipeline, of course, and usually it depends on the specs. Tennessee Gas says they're usually about 3 feet under the ground. But again, the idea here is that you don't really have water contacting the pipeline as much as you would with other types of crossings. Horizontal directional drilling, or HDD, is something that we always advocate for the most part. There is more clearing along the side of the stream when they do this, but in this way, the companies drill underneath the stream in order to not touch the stream bed at all. So here's the stream bed, they drill under, they lay the pipe, and they lay across. Now, despite that Kinder Morgan and Tennessee Gas and these companies are multi-billion-dollar corporations, this is an expensive technique. And what we've seen is they never really propose to do it this way. They usually propose to do a wet cut, and you'll see some examples of how they've done that in the past. So as advocacy groups and as groups, when you're thinking about pipelines, always remember, you always want them to spend the most amount of money doing the thing the best way they can. And when I say best, I have that in parentheses, right? Because none of this is good. But you will find that in many cases, the pipeline companies do not propose to do this. So you want to work really hard to force them to do that. And I think we may talk about Brandywine Crossing if we have time, which is absurd. So this is normally what happens with the wet ditch crossing. So essentially it is what they essentially are digging a trench for the pipeline while the water is moving, okay? So all of you who've, you know, play in streams, you know what happens when you turn up the stream bottom, you have a lot of sediment coming down, and that's exactly what they usually attempt to do. It's the bare minimum, and it causes a lot of problems, and we'll talk about that. This gives you some examples. This is the Lackawaxen River. It was the Pennsylvania River of the Year in 2010. And in 2010, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company dug a wet trench across the Lackawaxen to build their 30-inch pipeline. So you can see here, it's a little bit hard because the lights aren't off, but you can see here the plume of sediment, right? So they're just digging the trench, and all of this sediment is going downstream. And I want you to take a look, too, at the construction area here. So think about it as you're thinking about all this. This is for a 30-inch pipe, okay? So keep that in mind as you start seeing some of these photos of the right-of-way. So negative environmental impacts, a lot of you are already, into rivers and streams. So we won't dwell on these too long, but again, long list of different issues that can happen with pipelines. And again, this is why it's so important to be looking at the cumulative impact. Again, the sediment is an issue for our critters, right? The aquatic critters and the benthic invertebrates that live there. It's important for our fish species, and it's important for thermal impacts that happen when you cut away areas. A lot of the areas where pipelines go are in forested areas, right? These are the ones we're most familiar with in the Delaware Riverkeeper right now. This is the Columbia line, but you know, there's loss of habitat, right? Loss of mature trees that would otherwise be along these streams. This is the Schuylkill Creek. It's a beautiful, it was a beautiful exceptional value stream in Pike County. and it was cut many, many times in many different locations as different pipelines crisscrossed it. Again, our favorite stoneflies and all the critters that live there, right? And again, they form the base of the food chain for everything above it. The macroinvertebrates, these wonderful critters, also help with nutrient cycling. They're really, really important, and they help protect our water quality downstream. And that's why it's really essential that our headwater streams are protected. The pipeline company looks at a headwater stream that you could, skip over that might be 5 or 10 feet in diameter and doesn't think much of it, but these are really important streams. Stroud Research Center and many other scientists have proven how important the protection of these headwater streams really are, and that's what they tend to be cutting through. Again, we talked a little bit about fish and fish behavior. The pipeline companies, sometimes they will have windows of opportunity on the regulatory side as to when they're allowed to be digging and trenching to try to protect some of these important windows when the fish are small and during the egg stage. But you have to watch that too, because there's many ways for you to watchdog when they do this. But essentially, sediment can disturb the fish and the critters downstream, and the babies can't move that easily. Other things, forest fragmentation, you get a feel for that with these pictures. Invasive species move in, invasive plant species move in. Native wildlife species decline. I was at a meeting probably about a month and a half ago, and the biologist who was speaking for the pipeline company talked about how a cardinal is just the same as a scarlet tanager. There's really no difference. A bird is a bird, right? So I know a lot of us in this room would argue that. Creation of microclimates, it's also in the scientific literature how if you have a right-of-way that may be 100 feet or 200 feet, it really depends, there are effects in that woodland up to 300 feet from the right-of-way itself. So it's not just the right-of-way that's impacted, but it's the woods and that adjacent area around it as well. Not to mention compaction, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the Nature Conservancy did a great report. This is probably too small for you to see, but you can get it on their website. Talks about the issue of pipelines. And in Pennsylvania, they said 60,000 to 150,000 acres of Pennsylvania forest could be lost to new pipeline construction. Now again, remember, this is just new pipeline construction. It's not the 5-acre pads, it's just the pipelines. And you can see here, again, a little hard to tell, but the spider web and network of pipelines that are going in, you'll see every little nub here is a gas pad site. I believe this is Sproul Forest, which was again, state forest land that's to be protected for future generations. But this is what we are doing to our state forests here in Pennsylvania. Again, we're talking about, in this case, the Tennessee gas. I use wonderful Kinder Morgan and Tennessee Gas as an example because I've seen their work and I've been intimately involved with looking at this pipeline. They're running a 30-inch pipe. You'll see here, again, a lot of times the companies will run them along an existing right-of-way, right? So here's an existing right-of-way from the 1950s, kind of what we're used to seeing. If you go to Ridley Creek State Park or other areas, you see these tiny little existing right-of-ways. And then here is the new right-of-way. All right, and this pipe here is 24 inches. The pipe that they put in here is a 30-inch pipe, and they loop around here to kind of to add storage. But you got to think about, do we really need to have this much space for a 30-inch pipe? This is Craft Brook. Here at the bottom, it was a beautiful exceptional value stream, again in Pike County. Everybody know what exceptional value means? One person. Okay, exceptional value, it's really important, right? So in Pennsylvania, about 5 to 7% of our streams still have exceptional value quality, and that means they are the best and the cleanest streams that we have remaining in Pennsylvania, and we only have 5 to 7% of them left. Many streams don't have that designation. They're under that designation. So again, when we're thinking about how pipeline companies do things, this pipeline company was allowed to go in and wet ditch and wet trench all of these exceptional value streams. So this is a diagram you can't really see, but you get a feel for, again, this idea of existing right-of-way, then the new right-of-way. They put soil up here on the top. You'll notice that here's their existing right-of-way, but they never really use that because I guess they think it's too sensitive of an area to be on it with heavy equipment. So therefore, they're cutting the forest and everything next to it because they believe that that's not really a problem to be able to lay their new pipe. So you'll rarely see them putting any pressure on the, on the right-of-way itself, though Leslie Sowers and other people who are engineers who understand this, I don't understand this, okay, say that there are many ways that you can do it where you're on the existing pipe to limit and to narrow where you're at and to narrow the damage. And she actually will also say that it's less expensive in some cases. So again, why do the pipeline companies insist on doing this in this way? Some other pictures again of Tennessee Gas. Tennessee Gas is a Kinder Morgan company. I don't know if I mentioned that. If you have any stock, you might want to get rid of it. But this is the Tennessee 300 line. And again, you can see the forest fragmentation from it and the land clearing that's happening. This is Tennessee Gas's new Northeast Upgrade project. And Karen, are you going to talk about loops at all?
No.
Loops? Okay. Well, bottom line here with this is, so what happens is that the pipeline companies play a game, right, with our regulations. Because as you know, you make a regulation, and then the companies try to work around those regulations. And one of the things that they do is they say that instead of the Tennessee 300 line, which is this line that's running all the way along here, instead of them considering this to be one big project, right, because in the end it's all connected, they don't do it that way. They segment it, and so they do little sections. So they might come up here and do this little 7-mile section, and in the meantime, they'll come down here and do this little 7-mile, and they'll do these little, grid patterns to get away from the regulations and the environmental impact studies that they would have to do if they were actually doing an entirely large project like this. It's absolutely absurd, and FERC needs to hear more of this, and FERC is, Caroline Elephant says that they are starting to look at this, but it's called segmentation, right? So they're segmenting it out so that they have to do less environmental protections. And again, it's Kinder Morgan. This is all about how Kinder Morgan is safe to the environment. This is one of their flyers that they send to everybody in pipeline territory. And if you live in an area where there's a pipeline, you'll be getting these flyers. So just don't believe them, okay? And the other thing I wanted to point out here, another example of what the pipeline corporations do, is there's a little jaunt here. It's hard to see. This is the Delaware River here. And the pipeline company for the Northeast Upgrade, this is a project that's being implemented right now. We're trying to stop it. But they're going away from the right-of-way to go away from the national park and do a 7-mile jog through pristine forest here again, so they did not have to follow stricter rules from the National Park Service. So this is how these corporations operate. This is pipeline damage that's been done the last couple weekends and weeks. As of February 15th, Tennessee Gas had gotten permission to start their Northeast Upgrade project. Again, that loop that goes across this loop here. They're working on now, and also another loop in Wayne. They're out in Bradford County. And so this pipeline loop, this is also in Ridgewood. Our friends up in Ridgewood, New Jersey, that, have also been dealing with it. But you'll see they're starting to do the land clearing and the tree cutting. Delaware Riverkeeper Network worked very hard with the science and litigation to try to stop this project. Right now it's still moving forward, but we still have not lost all hope. There's tree cutting that's happening. But the company, another great thing, again, Karen will talk a little bit about the regulatory scheme, but this area, this non-co-located area in Pennsylvania, they still do not have their Army Corps permits, their Section 404 permit, but they wanted to go ahead and start clearing anyway, so they've been cutting the trees in this non-co-located section of the right-of-way. So the other thing that we looked at was soil compaction, because Tennessee Gas, the other thing the pipeline companies talk about is all this temporary workspace, they call it. They say, oh, it's just temporary. It's all going to go back to being beautiful. And we could see from their past damage that wasn't the case. There was a lot of issue where vegetation isn't growing, and I'll show you some pictures of that. But, as always is the case, we have to go in and we have to try to prove that. Meliora, went out with us and we did soil compaction studies to look at the compaction of these areas that they say are just temporary, because essentially they cut down the forest and they may just put timbers there. They might put, they might put some pipe there, but it's just temporary. It'll go back to being wonderful afterward. Again, then these were forests to begin with. And what we found is that the soil was so compacted that it was more compacted than the earthen dam, okay? More compacted than an earthen dam. So when the Army Corps, if you want to build a dam and it's an earthen dam, you want it to be very, very compacted, right? Because it has to hold back water. So what we saw in these temporary workspaces were numbers that were just as compact as an earthen dam, if not more compact. But again, the companies say it's just temporary. Loss of riparian vegetation, we talked about this a little bit. Pike County Conservation District worked very, very hard to try to stay ahead of the companies. This is why it's so important to have watchdogs out there that are looking at these pipeline projects too, because they work in so many different areas all at once. You feel like you're under assault. Like every road that you go back, you realize there's flagmen, and you're like, oh my word, the pipeline's here, and then you go back another road, oh, the pipeline's over here too. So it really happens very fast. It's amazing how fast they can put the pipe in, but it's amazing how long it takes them to do restoration if they do it at all. This is, again, the Lackawaxen crossing that we saw earlier. You'll see, again, for a 30-inch pipe, we have this space. You have a lot of steep slopes, too, right? So even when you're putting in these types of erosion and sediment control, BMPs, best management practices, when you're on a really tight slope like that or a high slope, it's very difficult for these BMPs to work. This is that same site talking about restoration and permanent problems. Same site 9 months after the pipe was laid in and carrying gas, and you can see the steep slope. There's Japanese knotweed forming here. There's clearly no vegetation growing here. There's a huge big mulch pile we've been complaining about for 12 months that's compromising the mature trees that are outside of the right-of-way, because they will also go outside of their right-of-way if you're not watching them. Air emissions, again, compressor stations, there's a lot of noise related to compressor stations. Anyone heard of the mini sink compressor station? A lot of people are working on that right now. It's up in New York. But a lot of people are trying to fight these compressor stations. Delaware Riverkeeper Network has some great videos on compressor stations if you're interested in seeing those. And again, violations. And these are just things, best management practices. When you think about developers going in and developing and things like that, you think they'd be doing the best job they could do. But again, you have people like Susan Beecher at Pike County saying, her quote is, "The things we see go wrong are the same stupid mistakes over and over again. I do not trust the contractor and company to manage this project. I am pressing the DEP to assess a penalty." And that's the other thing, right? They wait till they're all done with the project before penalties are assessed, and that's way down the road. Accidents and permit violations, lots of explosions. There were some Allentown explosions people might have remembered. But again, there's a lot of different issues that happen here. bentonite spills, mud spills, things along those lines. This is the looping that happens. Again, the segmentation that they do so they don't have to follow the strongest environmental protections. And this is just the Tennessee Gas Northeast project. It gives you the feel for the amount of impact, okay? 136 wetlands, 90 water bodies, 29 access roads. And this is all just in the Delaware Basin. Remember, it's in Bradford County as well. It's over in New Jersey, and northern New Jersey. We use Google Earth a lot when we're trying to get a handle on all this, and this is a messy map. But each one of these little pins that you can barely see is a stream crossing or a wetland crossing. Through some of the strongest places. This is zoomed in a little bit more. Again, this, you can't see it too much, but this is the elevation and the steep slopes that you have. So cumulative impact is a big deal. As you can see here, this is Bradford County. Again, I really encourage people to go up and see Bradford County. The orange are the proposed gathering lines. These yellow lines are the transmission lines. Every little red dot is a drilled well, and then a permitted well are the yellow dots. So again, remember, all these spider webs of pipelines are going to have to fill in this area as build out happens, if it continues to happen at this rate. Again, this is through the Nature Conservancy report. So it's looking at Marcellus well pads in southern Susquehanna County. This is in their medium development scenario, which is 10,000 new well pads in Pennsylvania by 2030, with an average of 6 wells per pad. And so each one of these is a pad site with a pipeline. And again, Karen's going to talk about the regulatory regime, but what I will say is that Delaware River Basin Commission, we need them to get involved, and I'd love for you to take some information, call them, write the Army Corps this week. In fact, it's really critical at this point. The Delaware River Basin Commission is only regulating water withdrawal for hydrostatic testing. This is the pipeline process, so they're only doing step 18. There's all these other steps, and we feel that because a lot of these pipelines are in special protection waters areas, they need to be more involved, as they were with gas drilling, and thank God that they were. So expert reports, science, and litigation. Delaware Riverkeeper Network keeps working on that. Probably 3 more minutes, Karen. And citizen action and testimony, the DRBC. This past Wednesday, we had a very rousing meeting at the Delaware River Basin Commission. We took the meeting over, which is something Riverkeeper usually doesn't do. We usually play by the rules, right? We do public comment, we do everything that we say. We do the dog and pony show, but we feel at this point they're not listening to us. So we had lots of people come out who are concerned about this, and there were 67 organizations who signed on to say you need to regulate pipelines. In the meantime, we do pipeline watch. Again, I'm out there in the field, but I rely heavily on volunteer monitors, as we've always done since the 80s, to know their streams and to help us get the information, because things move fast and it really needs a lot of vigilant watchdogs. Right now we're doing the tree cutting phase of the Northeast Upgrade project, so looking at inadequate flagging that happens, perimeter markings are not clear, so when a tree cutter comes in with a chainsaw, they're dudes with chainsaws, they don't exactly know where the perimeter of the right-of-way starts and ends, so we see a lot of trees being cut that shouldn't be cut. And again, just sort of documenting the harm that's happening, right? To also inspire people to take action and to get involved. As a native Pennsylvania, I am appalled that we're doing gas drilling. It's really quite amazing to me. I grew up in abandoned mine drainage areas of the Schuylkill watershed, where our streams were orange and where fossil fuels had contaminated the water, and we're doing this again now with another finite fossil fuel. We use Google tools, as I talked about. We do flyovers to get a handle on things. This is, again, when you cross the ridge, it's pretty amazing. When you cross the ridge that separates the Susquehanna from the Delaware, you immediately start seeing pad sites everywhere. It's absolutely insane. And here you have the pipeline that runs across it. This is, again, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline. We do pipeline tours to engage legislators and press and community. Folks working on the Commonwealth pipeline, please, you guys are early in the race here, so we have lots of room to change the outcome of this pipeline, and that's one really good thing. But just remember, these are tools to put in your tool shed. Rallies, marches, demonstrations, nonviolent direct action trainings. We had the longest tree sit in Northeast. When I say we, it wasn't Delaware Riverkeeper Network, but our coalition of people that are working on this. As you may know, with fracking, there's a lot of people with a lot of different talents that come to the table. And there's a lot of young people who are seriously concerned about this type of fossil fuel extraction. So there was a 9-day tree sit to ward off the Tennessee Gas chainsaws. Pledge of Protection, you have information there, so please sign that. April 18th, mark your calendars, come down to DC. We're gonna have a little discussion with FERC and little rallies. Sign petitions, get on the website, do action alerts. Remember, there are more sustainable ways than dinosaur fuels, right, for energy in our future. And don't be fracking crazy.
Faith, how do you really feel?
So Faith covers some of the things that I'm going to be talking about very, very briefly, but she did say coming to a town near you. I call it drilling operations coming to a town near you, because last year we were fighting something called Act 13 here in Pennsylvania that looked to take away our local control over not just gas drilling, but gas drilling operations, including pipelines and compressor stations. So it's something very important for everybody in Pennsylvania to be paying attention to as they need to transport gas in these pipelines. There's a pipeline story about Berks County, a compressor station story I can tell you if there's time. But let me just move on quickly to here. Faith had a picture of this that's better than mine, so I'll move on from that. And here are Berks County's pipelines. Here's something that comes right from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that shows just how many pipelines they have in the pipeline, so to speak. And this is just from January 2010 to January 2013. They put one of these maps out every year with the whole list of what they're working on. New ones are proposed all the time. The fifth one down on the pink list is the Commonwealth pipeline that I've been most involved with. So here's a picture of how it used to look on their website. Interestingly enough, yesterday their website went down. So we're not sure what that means, but I'll explain why that might be significant in a minute. But this is the map that came right from their old website. And so if you look, you can see this line up here, that's the Mark 1 pipeline. Commonwealth picks up where Mark 1 ends. And so it would actually snake down all the way through northeastern PA into central PA and then down into Berks. It would come into one of two townships. Obviously, it's kind of hard to tell from this map, but they've already indicated it would come down through Onalani Township, which is where Onalani Lake is. We know that it's going to go through Rescombe Manor, Alsace. It would have to go into Exeter in order to get to Union, and then it's Chester. Well, the important thing about Union and the beginning of Chester County, if you don't know, it's the Hopewell Big Woods. And so we're very, very concerned that they want to be driving this thing through the biggest unbroken woodlands left in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so that's what, among other concerns for people on their individual properties, that's what actually got communities together. They're concerned over their natural resources. And so this is from the old website, and you don't have to read through all of it, but basically they were saying that they expected the natural gas service to be in place by 2015. In order to meet that deadline, they needed to do something called pre-filing now, and that hasn't happened. So that's why I'm wondering about the website being down. We're wondering, since they can't meet their marks, if they're just revising their plans now or what. We don't know. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that they just decided to go away, but I don't really believe that's happened. So here's the old route, but this is what activism can do. Because if you look, you can see where Berks County is. It's the diamond-shaped county where I'm from, and I'm, by the way, Berks Gas Truth, so that's why it's so Berks-oriented. But you can see it's farther to the west. And so it was going through York County. It wasn't quite in Lancaster, but a lot of people from Lancaster got involved with a lot of people from York, and they fought, and they got their communities together. And all of a sudden, the route moved into Berks. So it matters. What you do matters. So here are some basics about the pipeline, and Faith really went over most of these, so I'll just make a couple of notes here and there. This is the pipeline diagram. Hers was way better. So here are some of the types of lines that she talked about. Here are some other parts, though. So the thing on the left is the compressor station. That's just one example. They look all different ways, but that's a compressor station, and I'll tell you very quickly the story that happened in Berks County, because it's something we need to worry about. Next to it is what I call a smart pig, and it goes through pipelines looking for corrosion. If there's ever a problem with one of those, there's a woman we work with called Linda Farrell who heads up the Pipeline Safety Coalition, and there was an incident with a smart pig running under her house. It knocked her out of her bed. I mean, when those things go wrong, they go wrong. The thing on the bottom on the left is a valve, and then the city gates are on the lower right. But going back up to the upper left again, the compressor station, during the hurricane, and Pierre over here was involved in this whole story, during the hurricane, there was an incident at something called the Burnville Compressor Station in Berks County. And what happened was people who were staying nearby in a horse farm taking care of their animals, they don't live there, but they were all staying there to care for their animals during the storm. They heard a huge sound that knocked them out of their beds around 11 o'clock, I think, at night. And so they started talking to neighbors the next day. Some of the neighbors, even closer to the incident, actually started smelling gas in their homes as soon as this happened. It stuck around for about 2 weeks. It's a much longer story than I'm going to be able to tell, but what happened in the end is that DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection here in Pennsylvania, was not responsive, but they might not have been calling the right number, so they reached out to Pierre, who had just recently been in the paper about things related to natural gas drilling, and Pierre connected them to me. I called the DEP, happened to speak to the guy who took the call that night during the hurricane from the company. They're required to report in saying something's happened, and they were following protocol, and given it was a hurricane, lots of things were happening. That was satisfactory to him. They did what they needed to do. They shut down the compressor station. He was fine. But he did need to forward that report on to the DEP Air Quality Office in Reading. That fellow had not looked into the matter because, again, things seemed to be done according to protocol. But when I called and said, have you checked this out? He said, well, if the neighbors are worried, we'll look into it. So the first set of numbers that he got were from the company itself. So that's the first step that they take. So when he asked the company what happened during this event, and they were just talking about it as a valve malfunction, which it turned out to be, a valve failed to re-engage. So when that happened, they reported that 0.41 tons of volatile organic compounds and 750,000 cubic feet of natural gas were released as a result of either the accident and or the process of shutting the compressor station down. And so that didn't seem to bother him that badly, because occasionally these facilities have to do ventings. They do occasional releases of stuff, and if they find that something in an emergency event kind of corresponds with what might be done in a typical venting, they don't get that worried about it. So those bad numbers, as bad as they sound, didn't really disturb the DEP. But then 2 weeks later, he called me back on his own to say, I have some more information for you. Turns out it wasn't 0.41 tons. When they did their own investigation, which is the next step, when they went there, they found it was not 0.41 tons, it was 61 tons of volatile organic compounds, and not 750,000 cubic feet of natural gas. It was 174 million cubic feet of natural gas released like that. And those numbers, they exceed the annual allowance for a compressor station in the matter of minutes, in one evening. So these are the kinds of things that you encounter all the time when you're dealing with pipelines and compressor stations. You know, I got into this by learning about fracking first. And as I got more and more involved in pipelines, I was told by Linda, who does the Pipeline Safety Coalition, who I mentioned before, she said, of all the Wild West things about all of this, pipelines are about the wildest, westest that they get. Because they're, and you'll see, this is an example of a right-of-way, and Faith had better photos of that, but these things have to remain open and unvegetated forever. But here's a regulatory soup, alphabet soup, of who deals with all of these things. So the Commonwealth's pipeline that we've been talking about is an interstate pipeline, but there are intrastate pipelines as well, ones that start and end within the state. Depending on what kind of a pipeline it is, there are different regulatory agencies involved with overseeing different parts of the process. That's unusual. The interstate pipeline is always a mess. But the intrastate pipeline, we're the only state other than Alaska that doesn't have one agency dealing with all of it. I don't know if anybody knew that, but we're the only ones except for Alaska. So FERC, that's a federal regulatory commission. The DEP, as I mentioned, was our Department of Environmental Protection. Department of Transportation gets involved, and I'll explain all this in a second. PHMSA is Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Administration. The PUC is Public Utilities Commission. DOE, Department of Energy, and then DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission that Faith mentioned. So there are all sorts of players in this. For intrastate pipelines, there are different steps along the process. So siting, where it's going to go, where it's allowed to go. The industry, for all of those agencies, the industry has oversight of that. Environmental impacts, it's the DEP. Gathering line safety, it's the Public Utilities Commission, except for Class 1 lines. The classes are determined based on population in a given area, and so Class 1 means it's a sparsely populated area. Last summer, I think it was Susquehanna County, there was a compressor station, once again, that exploded. PUC, who had just been given this authority under the law I mentioned at the very beginning, Act 13, that's the law that established all sorts of things that put PUC in charge of something they've never been in charge of before. So there's this explosion, they go up to Susquehanna County to see, to do the inspection, and as soon as they get there, they realize it's Class 1, too sparsely, too remotely located, it's not in their jurisdiction. So they turn around and leave. And so this only came to light because a lot of people were wondering why this thing had gone back online without an inspection. And that's why. Nobody has responsibility for it. Transmission line safety is under the PUC. Distribution line safety also. Compressor stations, the industry for the most part. But again, it all depends on what's happening and where it's located. Interstate pipelines, again, much more complicated. So siting of transmission lines. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're also responsible for the environmental assessment, the impact studies that happen during the beginning of the process. They approve certificates for transmission lines under the Natural Gas Act. But the one thing they really don't address is safety. And so when I was talking to the fellow at the DEP about the compressor station in Burnville, I said, now are there any ongoing safety concerns that I should be telling the neighbors in the community about? And he said, well, that's not my job. He said that's the Department of Transportation. So actually, when you're trying to fight one of these things up front before it ever comes to your community, everybody thinks immediately, well, I'm worried about my safety, I'm worried about my community's safety. That's not persuasive at this phase of the game. At this phase, what you need to do is demonstrate environmental impacts. You need to demonstrate just overall resistance to the thing. And so that's not persuasive. That your safety might be compromised is not persuasive right now in this part of the process when it's just underway. Siting of gathering lines, industry, siting of compressor stations, industry, siting of the city gates, the things that compress it further as it's being sent into the distribution lines. That's also the industry and the utilities. So we got all these agencies involved, but a lot is left up to the industry to do. Same with distribution lines. The environmental permitting, the DEP here in Pennsylvania enforces federal laws. So they're involved, but it's really a lot of federal law that they're supposed to be enforcing that's always kind of left to them to do in any number of situations. This is just one of them. Safety is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Administration, which is part of the Department of Transportation. LNG exports and imports, that's under FERC, but so is some aspect of the exporting, and that's part of the Department of Energy. So again, many players, lots of confusion. So what happens is if you find that there's a Commonwealth pipeline or any other pipeline coming your way, you need to be involved now. Like if you're the people down in Chester or the people in Berks who are kind of getting organized now, this is the time to be doing it. This is the time to be understanding all of this. And this is the time to get organized, and this is the time to get educated, because once this process starts, it's fast. There's something called an intervener that you need to become with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So that means that you have, unlike a public comment period, how many people have done a public comment? So, yeah, generally speaking, if you've been involved in one of those before, you'll see some deadline that you have 30 days or 60 days or more sometimes. With FERC, in order to become an intervener, which means that you're going to be able to comment later, you're going to be able to receive information about the project. In order for that to happen, you have 21 days. So you have to be on top of their website all the time, knowing that the next step has been taken. You really have to be on it, and you have to know what you're doing once you're in it, because for one thing, the FERC website is not all that intuitive. So just how to become an intervener is not that apparent to people the first time they go to the website. So you really need to know what you're doing early on. So here's a little bit more about FERC. The siting, the pipeline company engineers the site and maps the best location, but they're not really needing to contact affected landowners early on in the process. What was happening in Chester and in Berks, that the company Energy is actually related to UGI, and they were showing up at people's properties to do surveying. And actually a couple of people whose properties they showed up at were township supervisors who said, why don't I know about this? But anyway, but they really don't have to tell you a whole lot early on. Pre-filing, company requests FERC to review the project. And so right now, one of the things that they need to do at this phase of it is demonstrate that there's a market for this. And that seems to be what's hanging up the Commonwealth pipeline. They have not been able to meet that requirement yet. And that's one of the things that they would have to do by this March 15th-ish deadline that they don't seem to be meeting, which is why I wonder why their website's down. Anyhow, motion to intervene, like I said, you need to be in that. You need to do it in a window of 21 days. And then a docket number is established, the reviews, comments heard, conditional approval, and then primary FERC criteria, like I said, cost effectiveness of the pipeline project. So they offer two kinds of authorizations under the Natural Gas Act. Section 7, and this is the thing I was mentioning a second ago, certificates of necessity. In that kind of situation where they're determining if they've established a market case for putting in the pipeline, one thing that is legal under Section 7 is eminent domain. And that's really important to remember. And then Section 3, that has to do with LNG, and I haven't mentioned that means liquefied natural gas. And that's a process that they have to do in order to ship it overseas, which is frankly what they plan on doing with a lot of the natural gas that we get out of the United States. It's not going to domestic markets, it's going overseas. And that actually causes one of the problems for the company, because FERC, its mission is to make sure that the energy demands of the United States are met. And so they want to make sure that if you're going to put a pipeline in at point A and you're sending it to point B, there's a reason, because they need to make sure it's addressing the local or the domestic energy needs. And so sending it overseas, not so much. So anyhow, liquefying it in order to be able to do that is something they have some authority over, but there's no eminent domain at this point. In other words, if they wanted to put a natural gas facility, they can't just take the land from somebody in order to put that in. So that's where it stands at this point. But otherwise, the same standards apply. They have to prove necessity and so forth. Preemption issues. This is a big one. I talked about Act 13 at the very beginning. Act 13 took away local control when we're talking about things that are regulated entirely by the state, like gas drilling. When it comes to an interstate pipeline, there are different preemption issues to consider. So I won't go through all of them because I want to leave a little time for questions, but if you look at the very bottom, it says zoning laws, and they are preempted. So if you are trying to get your township or your borough or your city to fight one of these things based on whatever authority it has, it's not going to work. It's preempted. Eminent domain, that's another very, very hot issue for people. Here's an example from LaPorte, Pennsylvania, where a pipeline operator assured the federal regulators that they would minimize using eminent domain. They say that all the time. And as soon as they got their approval to go the next step, they were already readying the condemnation papers, and so as soon as they got their approval, they were condemning half of the properties there so that they could take them over. And here is something that Faith knows well. This is George Fainer. He's in that Tennessee pipeline area, and he is 86 years old, and at 86, he's been eminent domained out of some of his property, and they came in immediately. I think this is one where it was approved Friday. By Saturday, they're cutting down trees, and Faith went right up there to help. And so George Fainer, he's 86. He says, I'm too old to fight, so all he can do is cry for his trees that are gone. So I'm highly recommending that you check out this information. I've borrowed very, very, very heavily from Carolyn Elephant, who came to speak in not far from here, actually, a couple weeks ago. She wrote an entire guide on how to deal with pipelines and knowing your rights and so forth. Pipeline Safety Coalition, I've mentioned Linda a couple times. She's been having lots of problems this year. She's gone from one flu to the next, so she couldn't be here today, but she is an excellent resource at the Pipeline Safety Coalition, and there's her website. You can always contact me, and I'm very, very interested in helping communities who want to fight this here in Berks. I've been working very closely with the people in Chester. They've formed their own organizations called nopipelines.org, and so they're really on top of it. They have hundreds of people working on it. They've got people doing web design. They got the whole thing worked out. There's a petition for them actually right up here on the table. If you're anywhere in Berks County or anywhere in Chester, anywhere along the pipeline path, and you want to sign the petition saying that you oppose this project, feel free. And feel free to take all of the handouts. So that's it.